Chapter 7 in the textbook is on public expenditure and growth. So there's some repetition from the introduction of the textbook where they just gave us a brief overview of government expenditure. They start with the Constitution and public goods, and it's interesting that the Constitution of South Africa promises the citizens certain goods to be provided by the government, such as housing, healthcare, food, water, social security, and education. And what's interesting is that many of these goods are mixed or merit goods and not necessarily purely public goods. Fortunately, the Constitution also says that it's always within the available resources of the government. So you cannot force the government. We saw this a few days ago in class when I spoke about the government salaries, where they took the government to the Constitutional Court and they lost the case of increases in government salary. So if the government cannot afford any of these, then there's no way that you can force them to deliver. The second paragraph is on constitutional entitlement. So this is exactly these promises that the Constitution gave each one of us, that we have the right to education, and we have the right to healthcare, and we have the right to housing even. But what are the practical implications of these entitlements? How should the government decide what the priorities are? It will change from government to government. If the current government gets out of power and another one is voted in, then their priorities will definitely change, and then they will handle the entitlements in the Constitution differently. And if a group is unhappy with how the government works, then they can always go to the Constitutional Court and say, well, the Constitution promised me health care and I didn't get it, so you have to speak to the Department of Health in this regard. And then there are many judges in the Constitutional Court that will decide on this. This graph of the size and growth in general government we've seen before. It's on resource use and resource mobilization. You should know what these are and what the difference between them is. And the difference between the two graphs is transfer payments. Either interest on government debt, which is a transfer payment, they just transfer the money to the bank and they never get it back, and then transfers to households or firms. Usually the transfers are to households, and we're used to child grants, old age grants, disability grants, and so on. But during the after COVID, the government also decided to give transfers to firms that struggled as a result of the lockdown effects, and they're still doing that. So there are two tables which you should stare at to see whether you can see any trends in them. The government expenditure is always given in different formats, different dimensions. So there's an economic composition of government expenditure, as in table 7.1, and then there is a functional composition of general government expenditure in South Africa. I'll say a bit more about the difference just now, but the functional is almost like showing the government departments, how much is spent on the different government departments as they perform their functions in the economy, while the economic composition is more about the types of spending. So if we look at the functional composition, then you should look for trends. For example, defense. This is a percentage of total government expenditure, so the totals add up to 100% in the bottom line. So can you see over time defense has been decreasing? So they only chose 1994, 2005 and 2016. I would have liked to see more years, to see a graph. These are just 3 points, but defense has certainly come down, while communication also. Um, so the government used to be responsible for much of the communication, such as telephones, television, and so on. But nowadays, that has been taken over by the private sector completely. The cell phone companies and even lots of TV stations, communication has decreased. So one can understand that the government is spending less of their total budget on communication. And social services has increased, has been increasing. So health increased as a percentage of the total, and housing and community amenities as well. The government is nowadays spending a lot of money on housing. Education has stayed the same for a long time. Look at the percentages on education. The spending on education is very high compared to the rest of the world and compared to the rest of Africa. It's the highest of total in Africa, and our education system is the worst, is one of the worst in Africa. So that's why Zimbabwe has a much better education system as we have, and that's why we are very keen to employ their graduates from high school rather than our own. Then the economic composition of the general government. So that the difference between this comes from the IMF's document on budgets. The economic classification, it identifies types of expenditures such as salaries, goods and services, and so on, while the functional classification categorized according to the purposes and objectives. Or I always think of functional as according to the various departments performing their functions. So also in this table you need to search for trends. So salaries have been high since 1994, and it increased recently, and that's why the government wants to decrease it now. Perhaps bring it back to what it was many years ago. Purchases of goods and services very much stayed the same. It's interesting that everybody is complaining about public debt and the interest on public debt. Now 9% of the total budget is a very high percentage, but look what it was in 1994 when the ANC government came to power. So they inherited a lot of debt. And the then Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, in the beginning it was a very, very high priority for him to decrease the interest on public debt. So this is not so commonly known, but during the 80s South Africa had, well, this is commonly known, that we had sanctions against us. But what is not so commonly known is that the ANC government inherited a lot and lots of apartheid debt. And Mandela from the start said he's definitely going to honor the debt. The world would have understood if the ANC government just told the world, well, we're not going to pay back apartheid debt. But they did. They said they want to have good relationships with the financial world out there, and they honored the debt and they started paying it back. So I think that's a very good thing. Grants haven't increased that much. So we had a discussion on grants in class, but what I want to show you here is the trend, but the size. So there was a question in class, how sustainable is the grant system that we have? Well, if you think how small it is as a percentage of total spending, then one can understand that if the government, look at the compensation of employees, if the government decreases the compensation back to 34% from where it's now, then they're almost paying for the grants already. So there's lots of room in the government budget for grants if they reprioritize the spending, if you look at this table. So it's important to read the discussion of these tables and to understand the trends in them. So this slide comes from section 7.3. Unfortunately, the heading is not visible, but this is from 7.3, which is very important. The comparison of South African expenditure with the rest of the world. I mean, we see lots of trends in our tables, but if these trends are the same as the rest of the world, then we don't have to worry so much about them. But if our government expenditures and our pictures look different than the rest of the world, then we should question the difference and give some answers. The good news is that we are not much different from the rest of the world. So the states of development plays a big role. So in low-income countries, the bulk of the government expenditure is on building infrastructure. You can think a low-income country wants to build infrastructure, they want to develop the industry, and they spend money on primary education and health. As countries develop middle income, so South Africa is a middle income country, then the priorities on education, healthcare, research and development and so on, and even the social security system is increasing, and that means they have to spend more. If education is not primary anymore, then but it's developed, then it takes more money. High income countries then start focus on services, but they also focus on transfer payments, social security transfer payments. If you think of the Scandinavian countries, for example, almost everybody is rich and they pay very high taxes, but they also get very, very high government expenditure on very good services. So economic development is thus associated with the shift in the composition of government expenditure. As countries develop, their spending changes. So Saunders and Clough said that the expenditure shifts away from the provision of traditional collective goods like defense, public administration and economics, so purely public goods, and the spending shifts towards the growth of the welfare state. So you see more spending on education, health and so on. So the further developed a country is, the closer it could look like the welfare state. One doesn't think this of America, but in America also they take very, very good care of the poor in their country, and it's almost impossible to be destitute in that country. So then there's two big models of reasons for growth in government, and I will cover that in the next video.